Let's talk about Dungeons & Dragons, or as it's more commonly referred to as, D&D. There are many games that have attempted to adapt the D&D setting and style, and today I want to look at a few and give you an idea as to which do the best job at imitating it. And because two opinions are more interesting than one, I've got AJ here to help me out with his thoughts.
Hey everybody, my experience with D&D has been both as a player and a dungeon master, and I could not be a bigger fan.
In case you don't know, D&D is a shared storytelling experience led by a dungeon master, or DM, and anything can happen based largely on your actions, reactions, and of course, the dice. The games I've picked to look at today all take varying degrees of inspiration from D&D. Now before we dive into it, I do want to clarify that all of these games are fantastic, and the scores that I'm going to give them only reflect how closely they actually match the mechanics of D&D itself.
I'm basing my judgment of these games on the enjoyment factor of the game as compared to Dungeons & Dragons, rather than mechanically how similar the game is.
So we'll start things off with the most recent game of the batch, Baldurs Gate 3. It's so recent, in fact, that it's still in early access, so a lot of what I'm talking about may change between now and when the game's actually released. Baldurs Gate is probably the closest thing you're gonna get from taking pen and paper D&D and converting it into a video game. You can see this right off the bat when you are creating a character. Hell, even the descriptions of most things are literally copied from the rulebook. It was amazing to finally be able to visualize all these spells and abilities that I'd imagined for years. The game itself even plays how I would expect a faithful adaptation of the game to play. Skill checks are prevalent in dialogue and in many other actions, and most things come down to a classic roll of a 20-sided die. You can even replay the same dialogue and have two different outcomes based on the success or failure of a roll. And that is D&D. Short rests, long rests, and all other D&D staple mechanics, for better or worse, have all been faithfully adapted. Combat also follows the same general rules and flows as the classic game, and feels a little clunky, but hey, some people may love that slightly nonsensical system. More importantly, you can play the game with friends, which is a strong core pillar of what makes D&D. At the end of the day, Baldurs Gate 3 is probably the closest thing you are ever going to get to adapting a traditional D&D game into a modern, playable video game. 10 out of 10, this is D&D.
There is no denying that Baldur's Gate is a copy and paste of the D&D rulebook into the video game realm. However, I'm hesitant to give it a 10 out of 10 because through copying and sticking so closely to the rules and mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons, Baldur's Gate has lost a little bit of the spirit of D&D, which is the playing of events in any way that you choose. It feels like the story will progress the way that it was designed to progress, no matter what your choices are. There are some decisions that may lead to a different dialogue or a different cutscene, but at the end of the day, the major plot points stay the same. That's not always true in Dungeons & Dragons. Part of that is because you have a human dungeon master, and there is some flex to the world and the story and how it plays out. In Baldur's Gate, this flex is limited by what has been developed and coded into the game, which is true for all of the games that we'll talk about today. But in Baldur's Gate, it feels like there are a lot of opportunities for choices and unique outcomes that just never seem to come to fruition. I would say that Baldur's Gate is an 8 out of 10 in terms of being similar to D&D. It's got all of the mechanics, all of the classes, all of the spells, but it's missing some of that heart and soul that the tabletop version of D&D offers.
Divinity Original Sin 2 is a game I brought up in one of my very first videos, and one I have dumped a ton of time into because it is so good. On the surface, it does have a very D&D feel to it. The fantasy setting, the use of skills and magic in combat, some ability checks, a couple dialogue options to give your character a little personality, and of course the option to play with friends. It rewards experimentation, especially with skills in combat, and has a few different ways of wrapping up quests. However, if you're looking at how technically similar it is to D&D, it's pretty far off. Combat is completely different in terms of what you can do on a turn, and you'll pretty much always land an ability you want to use. Armor and shields are their own thing entirely to figure out. What few ability checks there are can all be passed with the right build and don't require any chance at all. Items in D&D tend to be pretty boring, and here in Divinity, they are wildly different. They scale in power to the point where you'll start off doing 9 damage with a knife and finish the game doing 2,000 damage with an axe. Also, the key mechanic of D&D, dice rolls, aren't present here. Sadly, although I love this game, I can't say that Divinity is much like D&D. The shell is there, but mechanically, it's pretty far off base. So because of that, I'm gonna have to give it a 4 out of 10.
I hate to be contrarian, but I'm gonna have to disagree again. Divinity, I would say, finds that soul and spirit of Dungeons and Dragons that I feel is missing in Baldur's Gate. From the time that you get onto the island of Fort Joy, you can go wherever you want, talk to whoever you want, accept or turn down quests as you see fit, and it won't majorly impact your overall progress through the game. It'll alter future encounters, it'll alter future dialogue options, and it will change your world state, which is something that I love and something that I feel is very similar to Dungeons and Dragons. In terms of that spirit and soul, I would say that the options are much more plentiful to be whoever you want, interact however you want, and play the game however you want, and create a unique experience for yourself. I've played through the storyline of Divinity probably 5 or 6 times, and each one has felt like a new and unique experience because I made it that way. That's how I feel about Dungeons and Dragons. In that sense, I feel that Divinity is a 9 out of 10 in terms of closeness to Dungeons and Dragons. The mechanics are different, it's a new system that you have to learn, but the spirit is there and the feeling of a unique adventure and a special story that you create for yourself playing out in front of you.
Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire probably sounds like the most D&D game on this list, and you can definitely tell it was inspired by it. Pillars takes everything that is D&D and just ramps it up. There are more classes, more subclasses, more skills, more armor, more hits, more saves, more party members. But more doesn't always mean better. I needed to watch a bunch of guides to figure out how to play the game. And even then, I barely understand why I'm winning or losing. That said, the ability checks are here and come up in clever little text adventures. Combat, while overwhelming, plays out about exactly how a fight in D&D would actually look in real time, which is super cool. And there's a huge focus on storytelling that makes it feel like your character has the personality you want to give them. Whatever you say or do is noted by your party member and the factions in the world, and affects how everyone perceives you. And the game even tells you there's no right way to act. Certain people will appreciate that you might solve a problem with strength, while others may interpret that as being more of a bully. And that's amazing. Although mechanically I'd say this game has more in common with D&D than Divinity, it still takes a ton of liberties and just ramps everything up to 11 in terms of complexity. For that, Pillars will get a 7 out of 10 for me.
I've never actually played any of the Pillars of Eternity games, but I've seen some clips and read a bit about the game, and it does sound pretty cool. So I'll give it a thumbs up out of 10 for now.
At the end of the day, if you really want a video game that comes as close to traditional D&D as possible, then I would say Baldurs Gate 3 is your best bet, at least mechanically. Divinity if you're looking for the spirit.
All of these games strive to give players the same experience that they would have in a D&D setting. Where all of these games fall short is the human element. Having a game that is narrated and controlled by a real thinking human is what makes Dungeons and Dragons special. And in terms of video games, we're just not quite there yet.
Messing with the DM's plans and coming up with stupid ideas to annoy them is half the fun of Dungeons and Dragons.
No, you cannot seduce the dragon. You're ruining my story!
Thank you, AJ, for helping me out and for talking gaming with me today.